The snow had been falling for 2 hours when Alara Voss stopped walking. Not because she was tired, not because the cold had finally reached her bones, though it had. She stopped because the road ahead curved into darkness and she could not see what was on the other side of that curve, and for the first time in 5 years, she realized that not knowing what came next did not frighten her the way it once had. Behind her, 2 miles back, the Ashwood estate was still lit up like a summer fair. She could see the glow of it above the tree line, 500 candles in the ballroom windows, a string quartet that had not stopped playing, the sound of laughter that carried even this far in the cold, clear air. She had been standing at the altar for 11 minutes when Lord Kane walked in. Not to marry her, to announce, in front of every person who had received an invitation to the most anticipated wedding of the season, that he had changed his plans. He did not look sorry. He stood at the front of that chapel with his hands clasped behind his back and his chin lifted, and he explained, in the calm, measured tone of a man reading a business agreement, that his engagement to Lady Prescott had been formalized the previous evening, and that the ceremony today would therefore not be taking place. Alara had stood in her wedding gown and listened to every word. She did not move, she did not make a sound. She stood with her hands folded in front of her and her shoulders perfectly straight, while 500 people turned to look at her, and she looked straight ahead at the stained glass window above the altar, and she counted the individual pieces of colored glass until the sound in the room became manageable. Blue, 14 pieces of blue. Green, 7. Red, 22. By the time she reached 43 pieces of gold, Kane had finished speaking and was walking back down the aisle. He did not look at her as he passed. His shoulder came within inches of hers, and he kept his eyes forward, and he walked out of the chapel, and the doors swung shut behind him with a sound that was much too ordinary for what had just happened. No one came to her. That was the thing she had not expected. She had expected noise, chaos, the rush of concerned voices. Instead, there was a long, stretched silence, and then the sound of people beginning to speak to each other in low tones, and then the gradual movement of 200 bodies deciding that the event they had come for was no longer occurring, and they might as well find somewhere to sit. Lady Prescott's family was in the third pew on the right. They did not look uncomfortable. They looked like people who had known this was coming and had been waiting to see how Alara would handle it. She handled it by walking out. Not running, walking. Down the aisle with her chin up and her ruined white gown trailing on the chapel floor, past the rows of people who parted for her as if she carried something contagious, through the heavy wooden doors and out into the courtyard where the cold hit her like a wall. Her carriage was gone. She stood for a moment looking at the empty space where it had been. The driver had apparently received a different instruction from someone at some point and had decided to follow it. She had no coin on her. The small bag she had carried had been left in the chapel's vestibule, and she was not going back inside to get it. She began to walk. The road from the Ashwood estate to the nearest town was 4 miles long and ran through open farmland with no shelter on either side. The snow was not heavy, but it was steady, and her shoes were not made for unpaved roads. She lost a heel in the first quarter mile and did not stop to retrieve it. She had been walking for 40 minutes when she heard the horse. It came from behind her, moving fast. She stepped to the edge of the road without turning around. The hoofbeats slowed. She still did not turn. "You are going to freeze to death," a voice said. She turned then. The man on the horse was looking down at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not pity, not amusement, something more careful than either of those things. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that the snow had begun to settle on, and he was dressed for riding rather than for a party, which meant he had not come from the estate. "I am aware of the temperature," she said. "Are you aware that you are still wearing a wedding gown?" "I am aware of that as well." He looked at her for another moment. Then he dismounted in a single, practiced motion and stood on the road beside her. He was tall. She had not expected that from a man on horseback. People always looked shorter once the horse was removed. "My name is Aldrich Crane," he said. "I have a lodge 3/4 of a mile from here. There is a fire, and there is hot water, and there is food. I am offering these things because it is below freezing and you are in a silk dress with one shoe. I am not offering anything else, and I am not asking for anything in return. If you want to continue walking, I will not stop you." She looked at him. She was very good at reading men. She had spent years becoming very good at reading men. She could not read this one. 3/4 of a mile, she said. 3/4 of a mile, he confirmed. She looked down the dark road ahead of her. She looked back at the glow above the tree line that was Ashwood Estate. She looked at Aldrich Crane standing in the snow in his riding coat with his horse breathing white clouds into the cold air beside him. "All right," she said. He nodded once. He did not offer to help her onto the horse. He simply turned and began to lead it, and she walked beside him, and neither of them spoke for the rest of the walk to the lodge. The fire was, as promised, already burning. The lodge was not large, but it was well made. Stone walls, heavy curtains, wooden floors with rugs that had seen enough use to be soft. A man she would later learn was called Greaves appeared from the back of the house with an expression that communicated significant surprise, which he contained immediately. He was shown 2 whispered sentences by Aldrich and disappeared again. Aldrich pointed to the chair closest to the fireplace. Ilara sat down. She had not realized until that moment how cold she was. The heat from the fire arrived in waves, and her hands began to shake for the first time. She pressed them flat on her knees and looked at the flames and breathed slowly. Aldrich crouched in front of the hearth and added another log without being asked. Then he stood and moved to the other side of the room and began removing his riding gloves. "There is a room at the end of the hall," he said. "Greaves will bring water. There are spare clothes in the chest at the foot of the bed. They will not fit well, but they will be warm." "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He moved toward the door at the far end of the room. "Mr. Crane," she said. He stopped but did not turn. "Why were you on that road tonight?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was returning from my own business. The road passes Ashwood Estate. I saw the lights." "Everyone saw the lights," she said. "Most people rode toward them." He turned then. He looked at her across the room with that same careful, unreadable expression. "I have no interest in Ashwood Estate," he said. "Or anything in it." He left the room. Greaves arrived with hot water and a folded set of clothes and a bowl of soup that was far better than anything produced in a hunting lodge had any right to be. Ilara ate all of it. She changed out of the ruined gown and left it folded over the chair without sentiment. The spare clothes were several sizes too large, and she rolled the sleeves up and cinched the waist with a piece of cord from the curtain tie. She slept for 12 hours. When she woke, the lodge was quiet. Gray morning light came through the curtain gap. For exactly 4 seconds she did not remember where she was. Then she did, and she lay still for another minute, looking at the ceiling, cataloging what she knew. She was alive, she was warm. She was in a stranger's house with no money, no transportation, no family within 3 counties, and a ruined reputation that by now would have traveled to every drawing room in the district. She got up. The main room of the lodge was empty, but there was bread and tea on the table and a small fire still going. She sat down and poured herself tea and held the cup in both hands and thought. She was thinking about how she had not cried, not once, not in the chapel, not on the road, not here. She was waiting in the abstract way of someone who knows an emotion is coming and cannot yet locate it for the moment when it would arrive. It had not arrived yet. She heard boots on the stone outside, and then the door opened and Aldrich Crane came in carrying a bundle of firewood. He saw her at the table and set the wood down and came to the table and sat across from her with the ease of a man who was accustomed to his own house. "You should eat more than tea," he said. "I was about to." He pulled the bread closer to her side of the table. She looked at him in the morning light. He looked the same as he had on the road, steady, unhurried. His eyes were a dark gray that was almost blue in some lights, and he had the look of someone who thought before he spoke and did not regret it afterward. "I need to tell you my name," she said. "I know your name," he said. She went still. "Ilara Voss," he said, "second daughter of the late Edward Voss, who held the Millfield property until his death 4 years ago. You have been engaged to Lord Kane for 8 months. He paused. "We're engaged." She set her tea down. "You knew when you found me on the road," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes, and you still brought me here." "Yes." She watched him. He met her gaze without discomfort. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone thinking of an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how honest to be. "Because I know Kane," he said, "and because I know what he is. And because what he did last night was not just an act of cruelty, it was a performance. He wanted witnesses, he wanted it remembered. He folded his hands on the table. A man who does something like that on purpose in public to a woman who has done nothing wrong is a particular kind of man. And I was not going to ride past you. The fire shifted, a log settled. You are his rival, she said quietly. She had known the name Aldrich Crane for years, in the abstract way that one knows the names of men whose disputes fill the local papers. Crane versus Kane, land rights, inheritance disputes, a legal battle over water access that had been running for 7 years. We have certain disagreements, he said, with the faint precision of someone carefully understating something. And I was his bride, she said. You were, he said. Does that make me useful to you? The question landed between them like a stone in still water. She watched his face for the flicker of calculation that would tell her everything she needed to know. His face did not flicker. Potentially, he said. But that is not why I stopped. She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked down at her tea. I do not know if I believe you, she said honestly. That is a reasonable position, he said. You do not know me. No, she agreed, I do not. He rose from the table and went to tend the fire. She watched him add wood with the same practical, unshowy competence he seemed to bring to everything, and she thought about what it meant that the most honest conversation she had experienced in the last 2 years had occurred in a hunting lodge with a man she had met the previous night in a snowstorm. She thought about Kane, about 8 months of small, precise diminishments that she had learned to step around the way one learns to step around loose floorboards. About the particular way he had of saying her name that made it sound like a mild inconvenience. About the fact that she had told herself, consistently and with considerable creativity, that she was misreading him. She had not been misreading him. I have nowhere to go, she said. The words were plain and she said them plainly. My father's property passed to a distant cousin when he died. My mother's family is in the north and I have not spoken to them in 3 years. I have no money and no carriage and the reputation I had yesterday no longer exists in the same form. She paused. I am not telling you this to ask for anything. I am telling you because it seems dishonest not to. Aldrich came back to the table. He sat down. He looked at her for a moment with that careful, considering attention that was becoming familiar. Then stay, he said simply, until you decide what you want to do next. That could be a long time. The lodge has 11 rooms, he said. Greaves has been complaining for years that it is too quiet. Something shifted in her chest, not warmth exactly, something quieter than warmth, the recognition that an offered hand was open and empty and not hiding anything in its closed fist. She was not sure she trusted it yet. But she was cold and she had nowhere else to go and the bread on the table was fresh and the fire was real. All right, she said, for the second time in 12 hours. She reached for the bread. Outside, the snow had stopped. The road was white and clean and entirely without footprints, as if last night had been covered over and was no longer required to exist. Ilara ate her breakfast and did not look at the road. There would be time enough for looking at roads later. For now, there was tea and bread and a fire and a man across the table who had offered her something she did not quite have a name for yet. She would find the name later. She was good at finding names for things once she had enough time. For now, she simply sat in the warmth and ate and breathed and let herself exist in this one quiet morning, without asking it to be anything more than what it was. It was enough. It was, she thought, more than enough. And in the chair across from her, Aldrich Crane drank his tea and did not push for anything, and did not ask any questions, and did not look at her like something he had found and intended to keep. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they have decided to treat with care, simple, steady. No. She had not encountered that before, not in the form she recognized it now. Outside, a bird landed on the windowsill, ruffled its feathers against the cold, and decided to stay. Ilara watched it for a moment, then she looked back at her tea. The morning stretched ahead of them, quiet and unhurried, as if the world had agreed just for now to hold still. Greaves had a system. It was not written down anywhere, and he had never explained it to anyone, but it governed everything in the lodge from the arrangement of the firewood stacked to the precise temperature at which tea was served to the order in which rooms were aired out on cold mornings. He had been running the lodge for 19 years, and in that time he had seen Aldrich Crane bring home exactly 3 guests who were not there for hunting. All 3 had been men with legal documents and tired eyes. This was different. He was not a man who asked questions that were not his business to ask, but he noticed things. He noticed the way the young woman sat at the table on her second morning and counted the grain lines in the wood with her fingertip while she thought. He noticed that she ate everything put in front of her without comment and said thank you every single time, which was more than could be said for most of the hunting guests. He noticed that she slept with the window latch checked twice before she settled, which was not the habit of someone who had always felt safe in the places where she slept. He did not say any of this to Aldrich. Aldrich had noticed it all already. Greaves knew this because he had worked for Aldrich Crane long enough to understand that very little happened in a room with Aldrich in it that Aldrich did not register, even when he appeared to be looking at something else entirely. On the 4th morning, Alara came to find Greaves in the kitchen. This was unusual. Guests did not come to the kitchen. He was in the middle of skinning a rabbit for the afternoon stew, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and she looked at the rabbit, and she did not flinch. "Can I help with something?" she asked. "No, miss. I would like to do something useful," she said. "I have been sitting for 4 days, and I am going to lose my mind if I sit any longer." He looked at her. She looked back at him with steady, direct eyes. "There is bread dough that needs working," he said after a moment. She came in, rolled up her sleeves, and worked the bread dough for 20 minutes without being told how. He watched her out of the corner of his eye, and she was competent and unsentimental about it, and did not talk while she worked, which he appreciated. When she was done, she washed her hands and said, "Thank you, Greaves." "Miss," he said. She left. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the courtyard where nothing was happening and thought about what 19 years of observing people told him about the woman who had just made his bread. She was not broken. He had seen broken. This was something else. This was someone who had been bent at considerable force and had not snapped, which was an entirely different thing and considerably more interesting. He went back to his rabbit. Aldrich, meanwhile, was dealing with correspondence. He had a room at the back of the lodge that he used as a study when he was here, and it contained 3 filing cabinets and a desk that was not beautiful, but was large enough to be practical, and a chair that was comfortable in the way that chairs become comfortable after years of the same person sitting in them. He was at this desk when his land agent's weekly report arrived by courier, and he read it with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that required action. The report was thorough, as always. Land agent Norris was thorough to a fault, which was precisely why Aldrich kept him. This week's report contained the usual entries about fencing repairs and grain yields, and one brief paragraph at the end that was not usual at all. Lord Kane had filed an inquiry with the County Records Office regarding the Millfield property. Aldrich read this paragraph twice, then he set the report down and looked at the wall for a moment. Millfield was the property that had belonged to Edward Voss. It had passed to a cousin named Horace Voss upon Edward's death, but the transfer had not been clean. There had been questions at the time about whether certain debts had been correctly accounted for. The matter had been settled quickly and quietly, but settled quickly and quietly was not the same as settled correctly. Kane knew this. Kane had known this for years. The Voss name in connection with that property was a thread that could be pulled. The question was why he was pulling it now. Aldrich considered this for 15 minutes, sitting very still in his chair, in the way he had of thinking through things that required patience. Then he took out a sheet of paper and wrote a short letter to a solicitor in the city named Fenwick, who handled the more delicate end of Aldrich's legal affairs. He asked Fenwick to look into the Millfield records quietly and to report back without drawing attention to the inquiry. He sealed the letter and set it aside for the courier and went back to his other correspondence. He did not tell Alara. She had enough to carry without being handed the particular weight of knowing that Kane had apparently decided that humiliating her publicly was not sufficient and intended to pursue her legally as well. There would be time for that conversation when he had more information. For now, the best thing he could do for her was let her have the bread dough and the fire and the quiet mornings without adding anything else to the pile. It was a decision made not from calculation, but from something simpler and less nameable. He went back to his letters. At noon, Greaves brought food to the study without being asked. He set it on the corner of the desk and said nothing, and Aldrich ate without looking up from his papers. This was their usual rhythm. She made the bread, Greaves said at the door. I know, Aldrich said. She knew what she was doing. She grew up in a house with one kitchen maid and a father who spent more than he had, Aldrich said. She has known what she was doing for a long time. Greaves nodded. He left. Alara spent the afternoon in the small library off the main room. It had perhaps 60 books in it, a mix of agricultural manuals and history texts, and 3 novels that had clearly been placed there by someone with different taste than the rest of the collection. She pulled out one of the history texts and sat in the window seat with the cold winter light coming in and read until the light went. She was not reading to be distracted. She was reading because it was something she could control. She chose the page, she chose the pace, she chose when to stop. It was small, but small was what she had right now, and she was taking it. She thought about Cain while she read. She did this deliberately, the way you move a painful shoulder to understand exactly where the damage is. She thought about specific moments, the dinner where he had corrected her pronunciation in front of his colleagues and then smiled when her face had changed. The morning he had told her that her opinions were charming, in the particular tone that means the opposite of charming. The afternoon he had described what their life together would look like, and she had listened and felt the ground of herself grow smaller, and had told herself this was normal, this was adjustment, this was learning to be someone's wife. She had been wrong. She had known she was wrong. That was the hardest part. She had known in the part of herself that she had learned to keep very quiet, that something was wrong. She had kept that part quiet because the alternative at that point had seemed worse. The alternative had happened anyway, only it had happened in front of 500 people, and she had been standing at the altar in 30 yards of silk. She closed the book. She was not going to cry about it. She had made this decision somewhere on the road in the snow, and she had held to it, and she was going to continue holding to it, not because she was made of stone, but because crying felt like something he would have expected, and she had a deep, fierce resistance to doing things Cain expected. She went downstairs. Aldrich was in the main room. He looked up from the book he was reading when she came in. He did not ask where she had been or what she had been thinking. She sat in the chair across from him and picked up the volume she had left on the side table that morning. They read. The fire went on burning. The clock on the mantel moved through its business. Outside, a wind came up and moved through the trees around the lodge, and the windows held against it. After perhaps an hour, Alara said, without looking up from her book, "What is your dispute with Cain actually about?" Aldrich lowered his book. He considered the question with the thoughtfulness she was coming to expect from him. Land, he said, initially. There is a stretch of ground between his eastern border and my western one that has been in dispute for 9 years. The original boundary markers were moved at some point in the 1870s, and both families have documentation supporting different readings of where the property ends. He paused. That is the legal dispute. She looked up. What is the other kind? He looked at her steadily. His father and my father made an agreement 30 years ago, a water rights agreement. My father kept his end. Cain's father did not. My father lost a significant portion of his income as a result and spent the next decade trying to recover it. He paused again. He did not fully recover it before he died. So this is inherited, she said. The legal dispute is inherited, he said. My feelings about it are my own. She looked back at her book. He does that, she said quietly, makes agreements and then adjusts them, privately, so that when you question it you look like the unreasonable one. The room was quiet for a moment. Yes, Aldrich said, that is exactly what he does. She turned a page. She was not actually reading it, but she needed something to look at that was not him while she said the next thing. He did that to me, she said, with small things, and then larger things. And by the time the things were large enough to name clearly, I had spent so long being told I was misreading them that I was not sure what I actually knew anymore. The fire snapped, a log shifted. You were not misreading them, Aldrich said. She did not answer immediately. She looked at the page that she was not reading and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. No, she said finally, I was not. He did not say anything else. He did not try to add comfort to it or reframe it or soften it. He let it be what it was and went back to his book. She turned another page, this one she actually read. They stayed like that until Greaves came to tell them supper was ready, and they set their books down and went to the table, and the evening continued in its quiet and careful way. Later, when the house was dark and she was lying in the room at the end of the hall listening to the wind, Elara thought about the fact that Aldrich Crane was the first person in 2 years who had said she was not misreading things, and had said it without needing anything from her in return. It was a small thing. It was also, somehow, the largest thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind went on moving through the trees, cold and steady and entirely indifferent to human affairs, and she listened to it and breathed and let herself, just for tonight, feel something other than the particular weight she had been carrying since the chapel. She was not fixed, she was not healed. She was not any of the things that stories said people became after suffering. She was just a person, lying in a warm room, breathing in and out, which was more than she had been able to say at the side of that road. That was enough for tonight. More than enough. She slept and she did not dream, and the morning came quietly and without incident, which was, she was beginning to understand, one of the finest things a morning could be. On the 7th day, Elara found the letter. She was not looking for it. She had gone to the study to return a book she had borrowed from the shelves there, and the letter was on the desk in plain sight, unfolded, held open by the edge of an inkwell. She would have walked past it, except that her own name appeared in the second line, and names are difficult to ignore when they appear in unexpected places. She stopped. She did not read it. She looked at the 2 words that contained her name and then looked away and set the book on the shelf and left the room. She went to find Aldrich. He was in the courtyard, talking with Greaves about something to do with the fence on the north side. He looked up when she came out and he must have read something in her face because he said something brief to Greaves and came toward her. "You have been in contact with someone about me," she said, not an accusation, a statement that needed answering. He did not look surprised. He looked, she thought, like someone who had known this conversation was coming and had been deciding how to handle it. "Yes," he said. "Who?" "A solicitor named Fenwick in the city." She waited. "Kane filed an inquiry with the county records office 6 days ago," he said, "regarding the Millfield property, your father's former estate." She went still. The Millfield property had been the source of the worst 2 years of her father's life, toward the end. She knew about the debts. She knew about the questions around the transfer. She had been 17 when most of it happened, and she had sat in the next room and heard her father's voice go tight in ways she had not understood then and understood very well now. "What is he looking for?" she said. "I do not know yet. Fenwick is looking into it. I should have a response by the end of the week." She looked at him. The courtyard was cold, and the fence needed work, and Greaves had tactfully found somewhere else to be. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said, "I should have. I was waiting until I had more to tell. That was my decision to make. What I am ready to know is my decision." He held her gaze. "You are right," he said. "I am sorry." The apology was direct and without embellishment. No explanation for why he had made the choice, no attempt to make it reasonable after the fact, just the acknowledgement that he had been wrong. She had never received an apology that worked like that before. She breathed out slowly. "Tell me what you know," she said, "all of it. From now on, everything that involves me, you tell me." "All right," he said. They went inside and he told her everything he knew, which was not yet much but was more than nothing. The inquiry was filed. Fenwick was looking. The nature of Kane's legal theory was not yet clear, but the most likely avenue was an attempt to claim that the original transfer of Millfield had been incomplete, which could, if he constructed the argument correctly, create a debt that attached not to the property but to the person. To Elara. She listened to all of this sitting across the table from him, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face very calm. "He is trying to make sure I have nothing," she said when he had finished. "That appears to be the intent," Aldrich said carefully. "He is not satisfied with what happened in the chapel." "No." She looked at the table. She thought about a man who would stand at an altar and perform a public humiliation with the precision of a practiced actor, and then, not satisfied, pursue the woman he had just destroyed through the courts as well. She thought about what it meant that he had filed the inquiry 6 days ago, which meant he had filed it the day after she had disappeared from the road in front of his estate, which meant he had noticed she was gone, which meant he had taken steps to ensure that wherever she had gone, she would arrive with nothing. "He knew I survived it," she said, "and he does not like it." Aldrich said nothing. He was watching her with that steady, grave attention. "If I had done what he expected," she continued, thinking aloud, "if I had gone somewhere and become quietly nothing, he would not have filed this. He filed it because someone told him I was still here, still standing." "Possibly," Aldrich said. "Not possibly," she looked up at him. "You know as well as I do that this is exactly how he works. He finds the door, and then he finds the wall, and then he finds the floor. He does not stop until there is nothing left to take." Aldrich's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Something that was not anger exactly, but lived in the same neighborhood. "Then we make sure he cannot find the floor," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me what you mean by that," she said carefully. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "Legally, the Millfield inquiry goes nowhere if the original transfer is shown to be sound. That requires documentation that your family may have kept. Do you have access to any of your father's papers?" "No, everything was with the cousin. Horace Voss." "Yes, we are not close." "That can be worked around." He paused. "There is also another avenue. Kane's legal strategy has a weakness. To pursue you for the Millfield debt, he needs to establish that you were party to the agreement. But the engagement contract, the one he broke by walking into that chapel and making his announcement, contains a standard protection clause. If the engagement was dissolved by his action rather than yours, certain financial pursuits are barred." She looked at him. "You read the engagement contract?" "I read a copy of it, yes." "The word landed when?" 3 days ago." She was quiet for a moment. "You have been working on this for 3 days," she said, "without telling me." "Yes," he paused, "which I have already acknowledged was wrong and am not going to attempt to justify." She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard, and the fence that needed fixing and the gray winter sky above the trees. She was not angry. She was trying to understand what she was. She was, she thought, experiencing something she did not have a recent frame of reference for. Someone had been working on her behalf without being asked, without requiring her to perform gratitude in advance, without telling her in order to earn credit for the effort. He had just done it. And then he had gotten it wrong by not telling her, and he had said so plainly when she called it. She had not encountered this sequence of events before. "Why?" she said to the window. She heard the chair shift behind her. "Because he deserves to lose," Aldrich said simply, "and because you deserve to not be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." She turned around. He was sitting at the table with his hands folded on the surface, and his face open in the way that faces are when people are not performing anything. "That is not a complicated reason," he said. "I do not want you to read more into it than it is." "I am trying very hard not to," she said honestly. Something almost like a smile moved through his expression, not quite, just the edge of something lighter. "Fenwick will report back by Friday," he said. "In the meantime, if there is anything you remember about the Millfield transfer, anything your father said or any document you might have seen, even briefly, it could be useful." She came back to the table and sat down. "My father kept copies of everything," she said. "He was careful in that way. After he died, everything went to Horace. But before that, when he knew he was ill, he sent a box of personal papers to my mother's sister in the north, a woman named Clara. He did not want certain things mixed in with the estate records." Aldrich looked at her steadily. "Clara's last name?" "Hartley. She is in a village called Brentford, near the northern coast." He nodded slowly. He said, "With your permission, I would like to write to her." She considered. She thought about Clara Hartley, who she had not spoken to in 3 years, who had been her mother's closest friend, who had sat at her mother's side until the end and then quietly disappeared from Alara's life, because grief makes distances that are not always crossed. "Yes," she said, "write to her, but I want to write a letter as well, separately." "Of course. I will explain. She will be more likely to respond if she hears from me." "Agreed." She pulled the paper and pen from the center of the table toward herself. She started writing. Aldrich rose without a word and went to make tea. It was a small thing, that division of labor. She wrote he made tea. The afternoon moved around them in its ordinary way, but she was aware of it as something, a rhythm, two people in the same space, each doing their part, not requiring anything theatrical from the other. She had lived in a house where performing gratitude was the daily currency, where every small comfort came with a weight attached to it, a ledger that was always being updated, always being recalculated. This was not that. She finished her letter. She folded it and set it beside Aldrich's, and she held her tea in both hands and looked at the fire and felt, for the first time in many days, something that was not quite hope but was standing in its general direction. It was fragile. She did not trust it fully. She had enough experience of things that looked like solid ground dissolving underfoot to keep one part of herself reserved and watchful. But the other part, the part that was warm and fed and not running, allowed itself just slightly to lean toward the light. She sipped her tea. Aldrich read through the letters once more before sealing them, with a focused quiet that she did not interrupt, and when he was done, he handed them to Greaves for the morning courier and came back to the table and picked up his book. Outside, the light was going. The sky above the tree line shifted from gray to a deep, faded blue. Ilara looked at it for a moment. Then she opened her own book and found her page and went back to it, and the evening settled around them like something that had decided to stay. The courier from Fenwick arrived on a Thursday, not a Friday, and it came with a second letter tucked inside the first that Fenwick described as recently surfaced from the county records and requiring immediate attention. Aldrich read both letters in the study with the door closed. He sat with them for 20 minutes after he finished reading and looked at the wall. Then he went to find Ilara. She was in the small garden behind the lodge. It was not much of a garden in winter, just bare earth and a few hardy shrubs that had held on against the cold, but she had started going there in the afternoons to walk back and forth and think. She said the movement helped. He had not questioned this. Some people needed to move to think. She saw his face when he came through the gate, and she stopped walking. "Tell me," she said. He handed her Fenwick's letter first. She read it standing in the cold, holding the paper in both hands, her expression moving through several things that he watched without commenting on. Fenwick had found the legal theory Kane intended to use. It was not the Millfield transfer itself, it was more targeted than that. During the engagement, Ilara had signed a document that she had been told was a standard property declaration, something required by the family's legal team, standard procedure. It was not standard procedure. It was a document in which she had acknowledged a debt that did not exist. A debt described in careful, buried language as a prior obligation of the Voss family, to be assumed by Ilara upon her marriage to Kane. Because she had signed it and the marriage had not occurred, Kane's position was that the debt now belonged to her independently. Ilara lowered the letter. "I signed something," she said, 14 months ago. They told me it was about the property declaration." "I know," Aldrich said. "I read it, I thought I read it." She stopped. She looked at the bare garden around her. There were 7 pages. The language in the middle sections was dense. I read the first and last pages carefully, and I trusted the explanation for the rest. "That is what he was counting on," Aldrich said. She looked at him. "What is the number, the debt?" He told her. She absorbed it without expression. It was not a number that could be absorbed with expression. It was large enough to be life-defining if it stood. "And the second letter," she said. He had been holding it. He handed it to her. This one was from a different source entirely. It was from a woman named Helen Marsh, who was a former secretary in Kane's legal team, and who had, according to her own account, recently resigned, and was now prepared to attest that the document Ilara had signed had been deliberately misdescribed to her, and that at least 2 other women had signed similar documents in the past decade. Ilara read it twice. "She came forward on her own," she said. "Apparently." Fenwick believes she had been considering it for some time, and the events at the Ashwood Chapel were the deciding factor. Ilara was quiet for a long moment. "He did this before," she said, "to other women." "It appears so." She folded both letters with precise, careful movements. "All right," she said, "what do we do with this?" Aldrich said, "That depends on what you want." She looked at him directly. "I want him to not be able to do this again to anyone." "Then we take it to a magistrate," he said. With Fenwick, with Helen Marsh's testimony, and with whatever Clara Hartley sends from the north. We build the case entirely, and we present it formally, and we let the legal system do what it is meant to do. And the debt he claims I owe. If the document was fraudulently misdescribed, it does not hold. Fenwick is confident. How confident? Very, Aldrich said. His word was exceedingly, which from Fenwick is the equivalent of anyone else saying certain. She looked at the bare shrubs. She looked at the grey sky above the lodge walls. Clara will send the papers, she said. She will want to know why first, and I will tell her, and she will send everything she has. I believe that too, he said. She looked at him. She stood in the cold garden with 2 letters in her hand, and a debt that was not hers, and a man across from her who had spent 3 weeks quietly building the materials of her defense, and she said the thing that had been sitting at the back of her mind for several days. Why do you keep doing this, she said. Not the reason you gave me before, I mean the hours, the letters, Fenwick, watching for information I did not know to watch for. You did not have to do any of that. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, I did not. So why? He looked at her in the flat winter light and he said, because it is the right thing to do. And because I find that the right thing is considerably easier when the person you are doing it for is worth doing it for. She held his gaze for a beat too long, then she looked down at the letters. I will write to Clara tonight, she said. Good, he said. She moved past him toward the door of the lodge. She stopped at the threshold and turned back. Aldrich, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He was watching her. Thank you, she said, for the thing you said, not the first reason, the second one. She went inside. He stood in the garden for a moment longer in the cold, with his hands in his coat pockets and the letters gone and the sky above him doing nothing remarkable at all. Then he went inside too. That evening Clara Hartley received a letter written in Alara's hand. It arrived the following morning by the fastest courier Aldrich employed, and Clara read it at her kitchen table with her tea going cold beside her, and when she finished, she sat for a very long time looking at the window. Then she went to the chest in the back room that had not been opened in 4 years. She opened it. The papers were there, every last one of them. Edward Voss had been careful, as his daughter had said, and Clara had kept everything exactly as she received it. She began to sort through them. 3 days later, a package arrived at the lodge that was heavier than Alara had expected and contained more documents than she had dared to hope for. She sat at the study desk and went through every page. Aldrich sat across from her and went through them with her, and neither of them spoke much, because the documents spoke clearly enough on their own, and what they said was that Kane had been building this particular structure for a very long time and had always counted on no one caring enough to dig through the history of it. He had miscalculated. He had left her in the cold in front of 500 witnesses, and he had assumed she would disappear into whatever corner the disgraced and discarded disappear into. She had not disappeared. She had walked down a dark road and a stranger had stopped his horse, and now she was sitting in a well-lit room with a stack of papers that were going to matter, and the man across from her was marking the important pages with careful, unhurried attention, and somewhere in a city office Fenwick was preparing a filing that would put Kane's legal theory in front of a magistrate before the month was out. Alara turned another page. The fire burned. The work went on. And outside, the first signs of something less than winter were beginning to appear in the trees, small and barely there, the kind of change that you miss if you are not looking for it. She was looking for it. She had started, without entirely meaning to look for things like that. The morning of the first society gathering of the season arrived with the kind of cold, clear light that makes everything look cleaner than it actually is. Alara stood in front of the small mirror in her room and looked at herself for a long time. The dress was not hers. It had come from a modiste in the nearest town, arranged by Greaves with a quiet competence that she had stopped being surprised by. It was deep green, simply cut, and it fit correctly, which was the most she required of it. She had spent too much of the last year in clothes chosen by someone else for reasons that had nothing to do with her. This was different. She had described what she wanted and it had been made. Simple transaction, correct result. She looked at herself in the mirror, and she thought about what she was walking into, and she made herself name each part of it honestly. 500 people. Perhaps not tonight, it was a smaller gathering, perhaps 150, but enough. Enough people who had been at the chapel. Enough people who knew the story or thought they did. Enough people who had been told in the weeks since the version of the story that had been spread through drawing rooms and dinner tables by Kane's version of events. The version in which she had been unsuitable. The version in which she had fled in disgrace. The version that had been running unchallenged for 3 weeks because she had been at a hunting lodge in the countryside reading history books and making bread dough and reading legal documents until her eyes ached. Tonight the version met a counter-argument. She was the counter-argument. She did not need to say a single word, she only needed to walk in. Aldrich knocked on the door. She opened it. He was in evening clothes, which was the first time she had seen him in them, and he looked different in the way that men always look different when formality is asked of them, more contained, the lines of them sharper. He looked at her with the same careful attention he brought to everything. "Ready," he said, not a question. "Ready," she confirmed. They went down together, and the carriage was waiting, and Greaves stood at the door and said nothing, but looked at her for just a moment with something in his expression that was not quite approval, but was close enough to warm her. The carriage ride was quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet that two people share when they do not need to fill it. At a certain point she became aware that her hands, folded in her lap, were very slightly unsteady, not shaking, just not entirely still. Aldrich, without looking at her and without making anything of it, moved his hand to the seat between them and turned it palm up. An offer, not a demand. She looked at it. She placed her hand in it. He closed his fingers around hers lightly and looked out the window, and she looked out the other window, and neither of them said anything, and her hands were still by the time the carriage stopped. He released her hand when the footman opened the door. He stepped out and offered his hand formally to help her down, and she took it, and they walked into the building side by side. The entrance hall was everything she had expected it to be. It registered before anything else as sound, a rising, humming note of social machinery at work, voices, movement, the clink of glasses, the rustle of fabric, then light, which was considerable, then faces which were everywhere and which began one by one to turn. She had known this would happen. Knowing it and experiencing it were two entirely different things. She kept her pace steady. She kept her chin at exactly the angle that was neither defiant nor diminished. She looked forward the way she had looked at the stained glass window in the chapel, and she counted things: the candles in the first chandelier, the buttons on the jacket of the man nearest the door, the colors in the carpet underfoot. Aldrich did not hurry. He did not slow. He walked beside her as if this was exactly where he intended to be, which was, she supposed, the truth. They crossed the entrance hall and entered the main room. The conversation did not stop. Conversations never actually stop at gatherings like this. But the texture of it changed, the way a piece of music changes when a new instrument enters, and she felt that change move across the room from person to person like a wave. She saw Lady Prescott across the room, with the woman's mother beside her and the expression of someone who has prepared for something and is now waiting to see if the preparation was adequate. She looked at Lady Prescott for exactly 1 second and then looked away. She saw Lord Kane. He was standing near the far wall with 2 men she recognized as his legal associates, and he was holding a glass, and he was looking at her with an expression she had seen before and had learned over time to read correctly. He had not expected this. He had expected her to be gone. Not just gone from the gathering, gone from the equation entirely. Gone to the north or the countryside or whatever quiet, out-of-sight place the discarded went. She had not gone. She was here in a green dress with her chin up and Aldrich Crane at her side, and she was looking at Kane the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they have finished needing. He started across the room toward them. Aldrich stepped slightly forward, not in front of her, level with her, just level. Kane stopped 2 feet away. He looked between them with an expression of carefully calibrated warmth that she knew was the most dangerous expression he owned. "Crane," he said pleasantly, "I had not expected you tonight." "I generally go where I like," Aldrich said, with the same pleasantness, the same precise temperature. Kane looked at her. His eyes moved over her with the particular quality she had spent 8 months trying to convince herself was not what it was. Alara, he said, her name in his mouth, that familiar particular shape. Lord Kane, she said, formal, correct. He smiled. That smile was the thing, not his anger which she had seen and could manage, not his cold calculations which she had learned. The smile was the thing that had undone her before because it was very good, and she had wanted, so badly and for so long, to believe that the smile was the real thing and everything else was a mistake. She looked at it and felt nothing. That was new. She waited for the old familiar response, the wish to make him more comfortable, the reflex toward management, the small internal rearrangement of herself to fit the available space. She waited and it did not come. She had somewhere in the last 3 weeks, without entirely noticing when, stopped carrying the part of herself that had learned to shrink for him. "You are looking well," he said. "Thank you," she said evenly. He looked at Aldrich. Something moved through his expression that he was very good at hiding and she was very good at seeing. "I trust you are enjoying the season," Kane said. "Considerably," Aldrich said. Kane smiled again. It was a different smile, she catalogued it. "We should catch up," Kane said, specifically to Aldrich as if she had ceased to exist. "There are matters we might discuss." "I think we have said everything useful to each other," Aldrich said pleasantly. "But give my regards to your legal team. They have given Fenwick something interesting to work on this month." A beat very small, the kind of pause that means something landed. Kane's expression did not change. He was much too experienced for that. "Enjoy your evening," he said and moved away. She watched him go. Beside her, Aldrich exhaled slowly. She heard it more than saw it. "All right," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. She meant it. She was, in fact, all right, steadier than she had been in the carriage, steadier than she had been standing in front of the mirror. Something about the thing she had been afraid of becoming a thing she had simply walked through had recalibrated her internal, whether considerably. He had been standing there with his smile, and she had felt nothing except a very clear-eyed understanding of what he was. That was not nothing. That was actually quite a lot. She reached out and took a glass of something from a passing tray and looked around the room and said, "Who should we talk to first?" Aldrich looked briefly surprised, then that almost smile again. "There is a Judge Harlow by the window," he said. "He has known me since I was 12 and will be pleased to embarrass me in front of you, which I will allow in the interest of making you feel more at home." She looked at the window. An elderly man with white hair and the expression of someone who has seen everything and found most of it mildly amusing. "All right," she said, "let us go." They went. Behind them, across the room, Kane watched them walk away and held his glass and thought about what Aldrich had said about Fenwick, and the thought was not a comfortable one. The smile did not come back. That at least was something. The carriage ride home was different from the carriage ride there. On the way there, silence had been the thing they needed. On the way back, something had been released in the air between them, some tension that the evening had used up, and the silence was different, more comfortable, the kind that does not require filling because it already contains everything that needs to be in it. Alara watched the dark road through the window. She thought about Judge Harlow, who had been exactly what Aldrich promised, warm and sharp and entirely unimpressed with pretension, and who had told her 3 stories about Aldrich as a younger man that had made her laugh genuinely for the first time in a month. She thought about the woman named Nora Aldgate who had found her near the refreshment table and had said, quietly and without ceremony, that she had been at the chapel and that what had happened there was a disgrace, and that she was glad to see Alara standing upright. She thought about the evening as a whole, the way it had contained things she had feared, and the things she had feared had turned out to be manageable. Not easy, not painless, but manageable. "You were right," she said. Aldrich looked at her. "About going, you were right that it mattered, that it had to be done and done publicly." "You already knew that," he said. "You would have arrived at it without me." "Possibly," she said, "but arriving at things faster is not nothing." He looked out the window. She looked at the side of his face in the dark. She had been doing this, she realized, for some time now, looking at him when he was not looking at her, cataloging the things she had noticed. The steadiness, The way he did not move toward her emotionally when she was at her lowest but also did not step back. He simply remained at a consistent distance that allowed her to determine how close she wanted to come. The fact that he occupied space without requiring it to be acknowledged. The way he sat in a room with her for hours and made her feel, for the first time in years, that she was not required to be performing at all times. She was looking at him and he turned and caught her at it. She did not look away. He did not look away either. The carriage moved through the dark, and the sound of hooves on the road was steady and even and entirely ordinary. "I do not know what I am doing," she said. The statement was honest and slightly abrupt, and she had not entirely planned to say it. "In general," he said. "With this," she said, "with whatever this is." He looked at her. "Neither do I," he said, "if that is useful information." She breathed out. "I am not certain I know how to do something like this correctly," she said. "After the last 2 years, after what I understood something like this to be." "I do not think correct is the relevant measure," he said. She looked at him. "What is?" He was quiet for a moment. "Whether you want to," he said simply, "and whether I want to, and whether we are honest with each other about both." She thought about this. "I am going to make mistakes," she said. "I am going to read things wrong sometimes because my reference points are damaged." "I know," he said. "And I am not going to apologize every time I need to recalibrate something. I would not expect you to. And I do not know how long the legal situation will take or what it will ask of me, and I cannot promise that I will always be easy to be around during that time." "Alara," he said. She stopped. "I know," he said again. "All of that. I am not asking for promises. I am not asking for easy." She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you asking for?" she said. He looked back at her in the dark of the carriage with a steadiness that she had come to think of as simply him, just the way he was, the baseline of Aldrich Crane. "Nothing yet," he said. "Right now I am only asking you to keep talking to me." She looked at the road outside the window. She thought about a chapel and a road and a fire and bread dough and legal documents and a green dress and a smile that had no longer worked. She thought about a hand turned palm up in the dark of a carriage, offered and not demanded. She looked back at him. "I can do that," she said. He nodded once. The lodge appeared ahead of them, light in the windows because Greaves always left lights on, and the carriage stopped, and they went inside and the door closed against the cold. In the main room the fire was banked low and ready to be built up, and there was tea on the table because Greaves had known they would want it, and the books were where they had been left, and everything was exactly as it was before except that something between them had been named, quietly and without ceremony, and was now present in the room in a way it had not been before. She poured tea. He added wood to the fire. They sat. She looked at him across the low flame and thought about the word honest, which he had used in the carriage, and thought about what it had meant in every previous context she had applied it in and what it seemed to mean here, and found that here it meant something she recognized but had not expected. It meant the thing you say without calculating what it costs you first. She was not entirely there yet. She was working toward it. She thought that working toward it, in this company, in this room, with this fire, was a perfectly reasonable place to be. She drank her tea. Outside, the cold went on being cold, and the dark went on being dark, and neither of them asked anything of the other, and it was, against all reasonable expectation, one of the best evenings she could remember. The letter from Kane's legal team arrived on a Tuesday. Alara was at the table when Greaves brought it in. She recognized the seal and she put down her cup, and she picked up the letter and she broke the seal and she read it. It was 4 pages long and written in the dense, circling language that legal documents use when they are designed to be intimidating rather than clear. She had gotten better at reading this kind of language over the last 2 weeks. She read it twice, slowly, and then she set it flat on the table. Aldrich came in from the study where he had been working. He looked at the letter on the table and at her face. "They want a response by Friday," she said. "They are claiming the debt is legally enforceable, and that if I do not acknowledge it and arrange payment, they will file with the magistrate by the end of the month." He sat down across from her. "What is your response?" he said. "I want to fight it," she said, formally. Everything we have, presented to the magistrate ourselves before he can. That means a public hearing, he said. Everything in the record, Helen Marsh's testimony, your father's documents, all of it. I know. It will be public. I know that too, she looked at him steadily. He is counting on me to be ashamed. He has been counting on that from the beginning, in the chapel and now here. Every move he makes assumes that I will be ashamed enough to go quietly. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not ashamed, she said. I was never ashamed. I was blindsided and I was hurt and I was standing in a chapel in a silk dress in front of 500 people, but I was never ashamed. He did what he did. I signed a document I was told was something it was not. Those are his choices, not mine. Aldrich looked at her. Then we fight it, he said. She nodded. Fenwick needs to know today, she said. I will write to him this morning. And Helen Marsh, someone should speak with her in person before the hearing. She needs to know what she is walking into. I will arrange it. And Clara's documents need to be with Fenwick before the week is out. They will be. She looked at the letter again. She thought about Kane writing it, or rather directing someone else to write it, sitting in his study with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has already won. She thought about the fact that he had done this before, 2 other women at least, possibly more, 2 other women who had, presumably, gone quietly, who had looked at a letter like this and calculated the cost of fighting it against the cost of accepting it and had found, as most people found when they made that calculation, that silence was cheaper. She was going to make it more expensive. There is something else, she said. Aldrich waited. When this is over, when the hearing is done and the legal matter is settled, I want it on record, not just my case, all of it. Helen Marsh's account, the other women if they can be found, the pattern of it. I want it in a document that exists and can be pointed to. He was quiet for a moment. That is a larger undertaking than this case. I know. It will require more time and different resources. I know that too. I'm not asking for it to happen immediately. I am telling you what I intend to do eventually, with or without legal support, because you have been honest with me about what you know and I am trying to return that. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was neither the careful neutrality she saw when he was managing information nor the almost warmth she saw when he forgot to be contained. It was something she had not seen before, something that looked, she thought, like respect in its plainest form. All right, he said. All right as in you understand, she said, or all right as in you will help. He leaned forward slightly. Both, he said. She absorbed this. She had not asked him to say both. She had specifically framed it so that it did not require both. She had been careful about that. He had said both anyway. She looked at the letter on the table, she looked at the fire, she looked at her hands which were completely still. We should write to Fenwick, she said. Yes, he said. He went to the study for paper. She turned the legal letter face down on the table, so she did not have to look at the seal while she worked. Then she picked up her pen and began making notes about what the response needed to contain. 3 days later, Fenwick filed with the magistrate's office. 4 days after that, a date was set. The hearing would be held in 3 weeks, in a formal setting with full records and both parties in attendance. Kane received the notification of the filing date at his estate on a Friday morning. He read it at his desk, and then he called his legal team and he spoke with them for an hour. And afterward he stood at his window and looked at the grounds of his estate, and he thought about a woman in a ruined wedding gown walking down a dark road. He had expected her to simply be gone. He thought about who else she had not simply disappeared from. He thought about Aldrich Crane standing next to her at that gathering with the particular stillness of a man who has decided something. He thought about Fenwick, whose reputation in legal circles was one of the ones that made people careful. He thought about Helen Marsh, who had resigned from his legal team 6 weeks ago, and whose silence he had assumed was the silence of self-preservation. He thought about all of these things and he understood, standing at his window on a cold Friday morning, that he had made a significant error in the chapel that night. Not the error he had planned that one, he had intended every part of it. The error was in what he had assumed she would do next. He turned away from the window. There were preparations to make. The hearing was held on the kind of morning that seemed designed to be unpleasant. Cold, gray, the sky the flat white of old paper, a wind that came down the street with enough persistence to make every walk feel slightly more effortful than it needed to be. Ilara noticed none of this. She was aware of her feet on the pavement and the sound of the door to the magistrate's building and the smell of the place inside, old paper and coal smoke, and the particular stuffiness of rooms that do not get enough air. She was aware of the clerk at the front desk, and the hallway and the room at the end of it where the hearing would take place. She was aware, above all, of the particular quality of her own attention, which had narrowed to a point. This was something she had always been able to do. In the worst moments, the attention could narrow until it contained only the immediate thing, the next step, the next breath, the next sentence. She had used this capacity many times in many rooms with Kane across a table from her, and she was using it now. Aldrich was beside her. He did not need to say anything. He had stopped needing to say things to communicate something several weeks ago. Fenwick met them in the hallway. He was a small, meticulous man with the eyes of someone who had spent decades reading documents with very small print, and he shook Ilara's hand and said with quiet confidence that they were well prepared. Helen Marsh was already in the room when they entered. Ilara had met her once briefly the week before the hearing. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with gray-streaked hair and the slightly held quality of someone who has made a decision they know is not reversible and is living with that. She had sat across from Ilara in a small tea room and told her account in a level, organized voice and had not looked away once. Ilara had liked her immediately. They exchanged a small nod, that was enough. Kane arrived 4 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. He came with 2 legal associates, and he carried himself with the same careful composure he always carried himself with, the composure that looked like confidence and was actually a form of armor. He sat at the opposite table and did not look at Ilara. The magistrate entered, and the room came to order. Fenwick presented the case first. He was, Ilara had discovered, the kind of speaker who did not try to be dramatic and was therefore considerably more effective than people who did. He laid out the matter in clear, sequential terms, the document Ilara had signed, the language it contained, the description given of it at the time of signing. The disparity between that description and the document's actual content. He presented the other cases. 2 women, both found through Helen Marsh's information, who had signed similar documents and had, on receiving the same legal pressure Ilara had received, paid amounts they did not owe and then disappeared from the situation rather than pursue it. He presented Clara Hartley's documents. These were the ones that settled something fundamental. Edward Voss had indeed had dealings with Kane's family, specifically with Kane's father, and those dealings had been recorded with the kind of careful precision that a man keeps when he suspects he may one day need to prove something. The documents showed no debt from the Voss family to the Kane family. They showed the opposite. They showed a payment made by Kane's father to Edward Voss that had never been fully honored. The debt Kane claimed Ilara owed was not a debt that had ever existed. It was a constructed thing, created on paper, hidden in a document given a different name. Kane's legal team spoke for 20 minutes. They were professional and they made their arguments correctly, but they were, as Fenwick had said they would be, arguing uphill. Then Helen Marsh gave her account. She stood and she spoke for 35 minutes without notes, in a clear, even voice that did not change pace or tone when Kane's counsel attempted twice to interrupt her. She described her role. She described the documents she had prepared on instruction. She described the instructions she had been given regarding how those documents were to be described to the women who signed them. She described the previous cases by name, with dates, with the amounts paid. She looked at the magistrate the entire time, not at Kane. At minute 20, Ilara watched Kane's senior counsel write something on a piece of paper and slide it to his colleague. She could not read it. She did not need to. She had been in enough rooms with enough people making that kind of sidelong adjustment to understand what it meant. They were revising their position. Helen Marsh finished. The room was very quiet. The magistrate asked Kane's counsel if they wished to respond. There was a brief, very precisely managed pause. They withdrew the claim. It was not an admission. It was described in careful legal language as a matter of insufficient grounds given the evidence presented. but it was a withdrawal, complete and formal, entered into the record. The debt did not exist. The hearing ended. Outside in the hallway, Fenwick shook her hand and said several things she processed at a slight delay. Aldrich stood slightly to her left. Helen Marsh came and stood in front of her and looked at her with the direct, frank attention of someone who has just finished doing something difficult and is verifying that it was worth it. "Thank you," Alara said. Helen Marsh nodded once. "It should have been done years ago," she said. "I am only sorry it took until now." She left. The hallway gradually emptied. Fenwick was consulting with the clerk. One of Kane's legal associates passed them on the way out with an expression of careful blankness that told her everything she needed to know about the conversations that had happened in that team over the last 4 minutes. Kane himself came out last. He walked through the hallway with the same composure he had arrived with. He looked straight ahead. He passed within 3 feet of her, and he did not break stride, and he did not look at her. He did not smile. She watched him go. The door at the end of the hallway opened and closed. She breathed out. Aldrich said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing at the right time. She looked at the closed door for a moment. She thought about everything that door had been. The year she had spent inside the understanding of what Kane was. The morning of the chapel, the road, the snow, the lodge, the hours of documents. 3 weeks of preparation that had felt at various points like climbing something with no visible top. The top was visible now. She turned to Aldrich. "It is done," she said. He looked at her steadily. "It is done," he said. "Fenwick will handle the formal record. Everything will be filed by end of week." She nodded. She looked at her hands. They were completely still. She had not expected that. She had expected perhaps some physical release of what had been held. Instead, she felt simply present, exactly where she was, which was a hallway in a magistrate's building with old carpet and coal smoke walls, and the sound of a clerk shuffling papers somewhere nearby. It was not a beautiful place for something to end. She found she did not mind. "Can we go home?" she said. She heard the word as she said it, and she registered it. Home. She had said it without thinking, and it had come out meaning the lodge, which was not hers, which she had arrived at in a ruined dress with no coin and 1 shoe, which had become, in 3 weeks, the place she meant when she needed a word for where she wanted to be. Aldrich had heard it too. She knew he had. She could tell by the quality of the pause before he spoke. "Yes," he said. "Let us go home." They walked out of the building and into the flat gray morning, and the wind came at them from the left, and she turned her coat collar up, and they walked to the waiting carriage, and she got in and he got in, and the carriage started, and the city moved past the windows. She was looking at her hands again. "I want to find the other women," she said, "the ones from Fenwick's files, the ones who paid and left." "I know," he said. "I do not know what it looks like yet, some kind of formal documentation, a record that exists and is not private, so that if he tries this again, or if anyone tries something like this again, there is something to point to." "I know," he said again. She looked at him. "You keep saying that." "Because it is true. I knew you were going to say it before you said it. I have been thinking about how to help for 2 weeks. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about 3 weeks ago and a hunting lodge and a man who had offered her shelter with nothing in his closed fist and nothing on his face except the steady, plain-spoken intention of someone who had simply decided. "You could have said that earlier," she said. "You needed to say it yourself first," he said simply. "The order matters." She considered this. He was right. She had needed to say it herself first. She had needed to arrive at it from inside, not be handed it from outside. He had understood that without being told. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "You are going to have to stop thanking me at some point," he said with the not-quite smile. "Not yet," she said. He let it go. Outside, the city thinned into road and the road into countryside, and the countryside into the familiar stretch of trees that meant they were close. The sky was still flat and gray, but lower now, softer, the kind of gray that sometimes resolved into something else by afternoon. She watched it. She thought about what came next, not in the broad sense, but tomorrow specifically. She would write to Fenwick. She would write to Clara and tell her what had happened. She would eventually begin the process of what she had described to Aldrich, the record, the documentation, the making permanent of what had been done. But tomorrow, today she was going to go home to a lodge with 11 rooms, and a fire that was always already burning, and a man who had turned his hand palm up in the dark, without making a performance of it, and she was going to sit in the chair that had become her chair over 3 weeks of sitting in it, and she was going to do nothing particular for the remainder of the afternoon. That was, she thought, enough of a plan. The lodge appeared through the trees. Greaves was at the door before the carriage stopped, which meant he had been watching for them, which she found, in a way she did not try to articulate, deeply comforting. She got out. He looked at her face and nodded once. She nodded back. She went inside. The packing had not been intentional. Alara had started pulling things together on the morning of the 9th day after the hearing with no specific plan in mind. She had simply woken up and felt, in the particular way one sometimes feels about things that have been sitting at the edge of awareness for some time, that she needed to do something with her hands. She pulled the small trunk from under the bed. She looked at it for a moment. Then she started putting things in it. Not everything. The clothes from the modiste were there, and the books she had accumulated from the lodge library and the letters from Clara and Fenwick that she was keeping. She folded things and placed them neatly. She was someone who packed the same way she did most things, thoroughly and without wasted motion. She had been doing this for 20 minutes when she understood what she was doing. She sat on the edge of the bed. She thought about it honestly, which was the standard she had been trying to hold herself to for the past month. She was packing because she had options now. The hearing was done, the debt was gone, her name was no longer attached to Kane's story in the same way. She had money coming, a small sum from Clara that her father had set aside before he died, and that Clara had been holding in trust. It was not a large amount, but it was enough to move, enough to rent somewhere, enough to begin. She had options. She was packing because options meant she could leave, and leaving meant she was not simply here because she had nowhere else to go. She sat with that for a moment. She had arrived with nothing. She had been given shelter without conditions. She had been given time and legal support and honesty, and a hand turned palm up in a dark carriage. She had been given a fire and bread, and a room at the end of the hall and 60 books, and Greaves's particular form of wordless, practical care. She had not been asked for anything in return. And now she had options, and the options meant she was choosing, and choosing meant this was a thing she was doing rather than a thing that was happening to her. She looked at the half-packed trunk. She looked at the room around her. She thought about the main room downstairs with the chair that had become her chair. She thought about the kitchen where she had learned that Greaves's bread technique was more nuanced than it appeared. She thought about the study where she had spent hours going through documents with Aldrich across the table, his pen moving in the margins in his particular cramped handwriting while her pen moved in her own. She thought about a carriage and a road, and the word home coming out of her mouth without her permission. She heard boots in the hallway, and then the sound of them stopping outside her door. A knock. "Come in," she said. Aldrich opened the door. He looked at her on the edge of the bed. He looked at the trunk. He did not say anything. She had been thinking about what to say. She had decided to say it directly, because that was what they had established, direct and honest, and without the performances she had spent years learning to give in rooms where honesty was a liability. "I have options now," she said. "Yes," he said. "I was starting to pack because I wanted to understand that I am not here because I have no choice." He leaned against the doorframe. He was watching her with the careful, steady attention that was simply him. "Are you leaving?" he said. "I do not know," she said honestly. "I was trying to work out whether I wanted to." And she looked at the trunk, she looked at him. "I do not want to," she said. "That is what I have worked out." He said nothing for a moment. "Because you have nowhere better to go," he said. Not challenging, asking. "No," she said, "not because of that." She paused. "Because I would rather be here than anywhere I can currently imagine. Because this house is the first place in several years where I have not had to arrange myself to fit someone else's requirements. Because Greaves makes very good bread. Because you turn your hand over in the dark without making a speech about it. Because I can read all afternoon and no one asks me what I was reading or why I chose it." She stopped. She breathed. "And because I think, if I leave now, I will spend a long time regretting not saying that before I left. The hallway outside was quiet. Somewhere below them the fire was going because it was always going. Aldrich was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the careful neutrality, not the almost smile, something more open than both of those, something that had not been managed or contained, something that had simply arrived on his face because it was the true thing and he had stopped doing the work of keeping it somewhere less visible. He came in and sat on the chair beside the window. She was still on the edge of the bed with the half-packed trunk beside her. "I owe you a similar honesty," he said. She waited. "When I stopped on that road," he said, "and I recognized you, I did not know what I intended. I told you it was not strategy, and that was true, but I also did not know what it was. I had a reason that I understood, and a reason that I did not understand, and I did not examine the second one closely, because it was not relevant to anything practical." She looked at him. And now you are sitting on the edge of a bed, next to a half-packed trunk, telling me you do not want to leave, and I find that I am considerably less interested in being careful about this than I have been for the past several weeks." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a lot of words for a man who usually uses very few," she said. Something shifted in his expression, the real thing this time, not the edge of it. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the word careful, which he had used, which she recognized because she had been using the same word for the same reason, a held distance that was not coldness but self-protection, the kind that people develop when they have learned what unprotected looks like and what it costs. She had been careful. She was tired of being careful. "I am going to unpack the trunk," she said. "All right," he said. She stood and she went to the trunk, and she began taking the things out and putting them back where they had been, the clothes in the chest, the books on the side table, Clara's letters in the drawer. He sat in the chair and watched. When she finished, she turned around. He was looking at her with something entirely unhidden on his face, which was new, and which she thought suited him considerably better than the careful version. She crossed the room and she sat in the chair across from his, the way they always sat, with the window between them and the light coming in, and she said, "Tell me something you have not told anyone." He looked at her. "That is a significant request," he said. "I know," she said. "I would not have made it a month ago." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When my father died, I did not grieve him the way I thought I would. I had spent years being angry at what Kane's family had taken from him, and I thought when he was gone the anger would go too. It did not. I had the anger and the grief separately, and both of them were difficult in different ways. And I had no one to tell that to because everyone expected the grief and did not know what to do with the anger." She held his gaze. "I told you something similar," she said, "about the documents, about reading something and trusting the wrong explanation." "Yes, and you said I was not misreading things." "You were not. You were not wrong to be angry," she said. "They are not the same thing, what your father experienced and what I experienced, but the shape of them, the particular way of being told your version of events is incorrect. That shape I know." He looked at her for a moment that was longer than usual. "Yes," he said quietly, "I thought you might." She looked at the window. The sky outside had done what she had thought it might do by afternoon. The flat gray had broken into something softer, lighter, the kind of sky that had not decided yet what it was going to be. "We are going to be all right, you know," she said, not because she was certain, because she believed it in the particular way that is not certainty but is something steadier. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "I know." She reached out and picked up the book from the side table and found her page. He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned back in the chair and found the place in his own book that he had marked that morning. They read. The afternoon went on. Outside, the sky made up its mind and softened completely into a pale gold that was not quite winter and not quite anything else, and that came through the window and lay across the floor between them in a long, unhurried line of light. Elara looked at it for a moment, then she looked back at her book. She was not anxious. She was not afraid. She was simply here in this room with this light, with this person who had turned his hand over in the dark without being asked. She was here and she had chosen it, and that distinction mattered enormously, and she held it quietly inside her as she read. The spring had come in the way of this particular part of the country, without announcement, simply present one morning where the week before there had been frost. The garden behind the lodge had begun doing things in the bare earth without anyone asking it to. Small and tentative, mostly unlovely, but there. Alara was not the kind of person who read meaning into seasons. She was too practical for that. She noticed the garden anyway. 3 weeks had passed since the hearing. Fenwick had filed the formal record. The documentation existed in the county records and in a copy held by his office and in a third copy that Alara had in the drawer of the study desk. Helen Marsh had signed her account formally. The 2 women from Kane's previous cases had been located quietly through Helen's knowledge of the situation, and each had been offered the option of having their circumstances included in the record. One had declined, one had agreed. The record existed. It was not justice in the largest sense. Alara was not naive about what legal records accomplished and what they did not. But it existed, and it was true, and it had his name in it with the specifics clearly stated, and if he attempted to do this to anyone else, there was now something to point at. She had written to Clara about it. Clara had written back a letter that was 3 pages long and contained 3 sentences about the record and 2.5 pages about Alara herself, the kind of letter that someone writes when they have been worried about a person from a distance for a long time and are relieved to see evidence that the person is well. Alara had read it twice and then put it carefully in the drawer with the other documents she was keeping. She was in the garden when Aldrich came to find her. He did this sometimes now, came to find her with a specific purpose rather than waiting for their paths to cross naturally. She had noticed the shift and had not said anything about it because she was still learning, in certain respects, that people coming to find her was a thing that happened for ordinary reasons and not because something was wrong. He had a letter in his hand. She looked at it. "From the estate solicitor," he said. "There is a matter of the primary estate that I have been putting off for some time, a decision about an old agricultural lease that needs to be made." He paused. "I will need to be there for at least 2 weeks." She waited. "I would like you to come," he said. She looked at him. "To the primary estate," she said. "Yes." She looked at the garden. She thought about the lodge and its 11 rooms and Greaves's bread and the chair that was her chair. She thought about a large estate and what her presence there would mean in terms of what people would understand by it. She thought about the word arrangement, which was what they had been calling this thing between them, not from dishonesty but from the particular carefulness of 2 people who had both, in different ways, learned to be careful with naming. She thought about a carriage and a word that had come out of her mouth without permission. "What would I be," she said, "at the estate in terms of how it is explained?" He looked at her steadily. "Whatever you want to be," he said. "I am not going to decide that and hand it to you." She breathed out. She thought about this. She thought about it with the same honest inventory she applied to most things. She had her name, she had her legal standing restored and documented. She had the money from Clara's trust, modest but real. She had the work she had started, the record, the letter she intended to write to the woman who had agreed to be included, the slow construction of something that would outlast the circumstances that had created it. She had also this particular thing she was looking at, a man who had stood level with her at a gathering and said both and turned his hand over and came to find her in Gardens. "I would like to come," she said, "as what I am." He looked at her. "And what is that?" She met his gaze directly. "Someone who chose to be here," she said, "someone who unpacked the trunk." Something crossed his face, not the almost smile, the full one which she had seen perhaps 3 times and which was, she thought, the best-kept secret version of him, the one that appeared only when he had stopped doing the work of not letting things show. "All right," he said. "When do we leave?" "Friday, if that suits." She looked back at the garden. She looked at the small, tentative things coming up in the bare earth. "It suits," she said. He nodded once and went back inside. She stood in the garden for a moment longer. She was thinking about the primary estate, which she had never seen. She was thinking about 2 weeks, which was not a short time, and what 2 weeks at a large estate looked like, and what it meant that he had asked her to come, and what it meant that she had said yes without requiring him to define the terms first. She was thinking about the fact that she was not afraid. Not of Kane, who was still out there, but who was now out there with a legal record attached to his name and a case history that could be retrieved. Not of the road or the cold or the what comes next. Not of what people would say about her at the primary estate or in the county generally, because people would say things regardless, and she had spent enough of her life trying to preemptively manage their opinions. She was not afraid. She was, she thought, something very close to ready. She touched one of the small stems coming up in the garden, firm, cold still but firm. She straightened up. She went inside. The lodge was warm and smelled of the bread Greaves had been making since 7 in the morning, and the fire was going, and her books were on the side table with her letter from Clara in the drawer, and the copy of the legal record in the one beside it, and she walked through the main room to the study and sat down and picked up her pen. She had letters to write. The work continued, as it would continue after Friday and after the estate, and after all the individual nexts that lined up ahead of her without resolving into any particular shape. She was not required to know the shape. She was only required to know the next thing. She began to write. Aldrich was at the other desk, going through the lease documents, his pen moving in the margins in the particular cramped handwriting she had learned to read over many afternoons. He did not look up when she sat down. She did not expect him to. This was their rhythm and it required nothing. She wrote her letter. Outside, the spring went on being early and tentative and entirely unimpressed with its own significance, which was, she thought, the correct way for things to begin. There was no fanfare. There was only the next morning, and the one after that, and the work, and the fire, and the person across the desk who had made a decision on a dark road that neither of them had fully understood at the time. They were understanding it now. She turned the page and kept writing. The story was not finished. Stories like this did not finish in the clean, complete way of accounts rendered and balances settled. They continued on into ordinary days that were not extraordinary except in the fact that she had chosen them. She had chosen them. She looked at that fact for exactly 1 moment, held it, and then looked back at her letter. She wrote. He wrote. The fire burned. The morning light came through the window and lay across the desk between them and moved slowly, as all light moves, in the direction that all light eventually goes. And she was here. She was here and she had chosen it, and she was not waiting to be told what came next. She was going to find out.